Hi there. If you've chosen to listen to this story, thank you. Not just for clicking on it, but for staying. This won't be a history lesson with bullet points and dry recitations. This is a story of a girl born into silence, wrapped in scandal, and destined to rule a world that didn't want her. If you've ever felt unwanted, doubted, or dismissed, you may find yourself in her shadows. Let's begin. Not with a crown, but with a cry. The court was quiet that night, not because the corridors were empty, but because no one dared to speak too loudly. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, the flame-haired scandal of Europe, was in labor. The air in the palace hung heavy with expectation. The nation held its breath, hoping for a boy. And then, a girl. Elizabeth Tudor was born into disappointment. It wasn't her fault, but it was her curse. When the midwives brought the child to the king, Henry did not smile. He looked upon his daughter, his second daughter, with eyes that searched for something more, something she could never be. He named her Elizabeth, perhaps after his mother, or perhaps out of duty. But there was no celebration, no grand announcement, no parade through the streets of London. There was only the sound of quiet footsteps and hushed prayers. She was a princess, yes, but in England, princesses were only placeholders until a real heir arrived. Anne Boleyn tried to smile through it. She held her daughter, kissed her fine forehead, and whispered promises that she would be loved, that she would be strong, that she would be safe. But queens who bear daughter instead of sons do not stay safe for long. The court began to whisper, "Another girl? What a shame. Poor Anne." The king is already looking elsewhere. Elizabeth, barely a year old, was already losing her place in the line of succession. A stroke of ink on royal parchment would undo her birthright, and so it did. With the annulment of her parents' marriage and the execution of her mother, Elizabeth became illegitimate, a bastard, stripped of rank, title, and security. She had been born into a cage, and then the bars were tightened. They say memory doesn't form in infancy, but some wounds live in the bones. She would never remember her mother's voice, only that it vanished. When Anne Boleyn was taken to the Tower, Elizabeth was not told. When the blade fell, no one covered her ears. When the Queen was buried, no one told the child who no longer had a mother. But she noticed that the halls grew quieter, that her caretakers changed, that the warmth was gone. Henry VIII remarried, and remarried again, and again. Each time, Elizabeth watched as another woman wore the crown her mother once bore. Each time, she wondered what a daughter must do to be seen, to be kept. She learned to be quiet, to listen before she spoke, to bow when not asked, to read between the sighs of the court. Books became her haven, and silence her shield. Henry would visit occasionally, but it was not the warmth of a father. It was the inspection of a sovereign. He would nod, perhaps pat her on the head. Once he praised her cleverness when she quoted scripture in Latin, but his eyes never softened. Elizabeth knew better than to hope. Hope, after all, is a dangerous thing for a girl with no power. But what she had, what no one could strip from her, was her mind. And even now, in the cold echo of royal chambers, that mind was watching, learning. She learned how quickly a crown could turn into a noose, how smiles could mean betrayal, how silence could save a life. And though she was alone, she was never lost, because she knew, somewhere, deep within the marrow of her being, that she was not meant to disappear. Not yet, not ever. So she grew, quietly, sharply, like frost on a window pane. And if you lean in close enough, even now, you might hear the whisper that followed her through every corridor. She was never supposed to survive this? And yet, here she is. If this beginning moved you, even just a little, feel free to like the video, leave a thought in the comments, or subscribe for the next chapter of her story. No pressure, just gratitude. The tower loomed like a wound on the horizon. Gray stone, black flags, silence deeper than death. They didn't tell Elizabeth, but she knew. A child's world is made of gestures, glances, and absences. She noticed when her mother stopped visiting, when the servants folded their hands tighter, when no one mentioned Anne anymore, not even in whispers. The halls that once echoed with laughter were hushed now. Elizabeth's footsteps felt louder. Her nursemaid averted her gaze more often, and the sunlight somehow had grown colder. Some say children do not understand grief, but Elizabeth did. She was barely 3 when Anne Boleyn was arrested. The Queen, her mother, was charged with adultery, treason, and worse. A trial was staged and guilt pre-written. Witnesses were summoned and the verdict rehearsed. All of England watched. Elizabeth was kept away. But distance did not protect her. They dressed her in a plain gown that morning. No jewels, no ribbons. A carriage waited without fanfare. She was told she was going to live somewhere else for a while, away from the palace, just for a time. She asked for her mother. They said nothing. Somewhere in the tower, Anne Boleyn faced the scaffold with fire in her eyes, a crimson dress, a small prayer, a clean blade. When the axe fell, the kingdom exhaled, but Elizabeth, miles away, felt it in her chest. A thunder with no sound, a rip in the air that never quite closed. She never got to say goodbye. There is no record of how she mourned, no letters, no drawings. But we know this. After that day, Elizabeth became very quiet. She was taken to Hatfield, far from court, a Tudor daughter in name only now. Bastard, some called her. Forgotten, others whispered. But she heard them. Through walls, beneath doors, between lines of scripture. So she learned silence. Not the silence of defeat, but of strategy. The kind of quiet that listens, memorizes, waits. Behind curtains, she watched ambassadors argue. Behind books, she observed how servants moved. She learned who bowed deepest and who merely pretended. She watched the shape of power and how easily it turned. Anne Boleyn had spoken too boldly, laughed too freely, wielded charm like a blade, and now she was gone. Elizabeth would not make the same mistake. She studied faces like maps. She read eyes as if they contained scriptures. She practiced smiles in the mirror, not too wide, not too cold. She rehearsed answers to questions not yet asked. Each day she read Latin, Greek, French. She consumed histories like others drank wine. She read about queens who had fallen, kings who had lied, and how truth was often just the best told story. She memorized. She survived. And yet, behind every triumph of learning there was a shadow. Her mother's ghost did not appear in dreams or dark corners, but it hovered in the silence, in the pages left blank, in the words she dared not say aloud. Sometimes, when alone, Elizabeth would walk the garden paths and whisper questions to no one. Do you miss me? Were you afraid? Did you know they would lie? No answers came, so she made her own. History, after all, belongs not to those who suffer, but to those who write. And even then, even as a child barely tall enough to look over the table, Elizabeth knew she would write her own. But first, she had to survive the silence. If you're still listening, thank you. Not everyone has the strength to stay through the quietest parts of a story. If this spoke to you in any way, feel free to like, comment, or subscribe. It helps us keep telling the stories that matter, not the loudest ones, but perhaps the truest. They gave her books instead of lullabies. No bedtime stories, no warm embraces. Just parchment and ink heavy tomes, and silent hours. And in that quiet, Elizabeth flourished. Hatfield was not a palace, but a prison with a library. Her tutors were strict, but some, like Roger Ascham, saw beyond her crownless head and illegitimate title. They saw her mind. Ascham was not merely a teacher, he was a craftsman of thought, and in Elizabeth he found a prodigy. Latin came first, then French, then Italian, Greek, Spanish, and later, Welsh. Not for courtly display, but for understanding. She read Cicero before she could tie her own gown. She debated Plato with the confidence of a scholar. Her prayers? Fluent in 3 languages. But Elizabeth did not learn to please. She learned to survive. In every line of Aristotle, she found the precision that life lacked. In Euclid's geometry, a promise. Some things, at least, could be proven. And in history, she traced the patterns of rise and fall, betrayal and ascension, every beheaded queen, every usurped prince, lessons carved in blood. Knowledge became armor, words became weapons. One afternoon, during a rare visit to court, she was summoned to speak before her father. Henry VIII, bloated, volatile, aging like a storm that would not pass. Most children trembled. Elizabeth curtsied and looked him in the eye. He asked her something casual, perhaps her thoughts on religion or loyalty or fate. A trap dressed in silk. She answered with such clarity, such precision, that the court fell silent. No flattery, no fear, just reason. The king stared. Then he laughed. "A mind like a blade," he said. But he never invited her again. It was safer that way. She knew too well that one wrong word could end a life. So she mastered not just what to say, but when not to speak. If questioned, she replied with questions. If pressed, she wrapped truth in riddles. She learned the dance of ambiguity, a waltz that would serve her for decades. When her sister Mary ascended the throne, Elizabeth remained poised. She praised the queen when necessary, avoided when wise, and charmed when possible, all while reading, writing, and watching. She composed letters that scholars studied. She wrote treatises before other girls. Her age knew how to sign their name, and behind her calm eyes, there was always a calculation. Imagine her at 15, pen in hand, ink-stained fingers, scribbling notes on Machiavelli while others danced. Not because she wished for power, yet, but because she understood it. She memorized the names of every noble family, who was rising, who was bleeding, who was marrying whom. She wrote in cipher. She read forbidden books. She listened to gossip with a scholar's attention, a spy's discretion. Elizabeth was not protected by armies or alliances. She was protected by wit. And as the years passed, those who underestimated her did so only once. She had no crown, no guarantee. She was a girl born from scandal, banished from court, daughter of a disgraced queen. But in the margins of books and the silence of corridors, she was building something, a mind sharper than steel, a will forged in exile, because she knew, one day, they would come for her. And when they did, she would be ready. If this part of her story struck a chord, please consider liking, subscribing, or sharing your thoughts in the comments. These aren't just tales. They're echoes of minds who fought to exist in a world that wanted them silent. And sometimes, the quietest voices leave the deepest marks. There are moments in life when silence becomes not only survival, but defiance. Elizabeth's world had taught her the art of silence, how to speak in riddles, how to hide behind words. But in the spring of 1554, even silence couldn't protect her. The court was burning with fear and whispers. Rebellion was in the air, and her name, unspoken for years, suddenly rang in every dark corridor. Wyatt's rebellion, treason, plots. And then, Elizabeth. It didn't matter that she hadn't lifted a finger. It didn't matter that she had written no order, met with no traitor, planned no uprising. Suspicion, like wildfire, needs no truth to feed it. One cold morning, they came for her. No ceremony, no explanation. Just soldiers and the Queen's seal. She was 20 years old. They led her through London streets like a warning, and every step echoed with the silence of people too afraid to meet her eyes. Rain soaked her cloak, her hood sagging. She walked with her back straight. The Tower of London loomed ahead, that place of echoes and ghosts. Her mother had died inside those walls. Now, so might she. She crossed under the Traitor's Gate, the very name carved with finality. In that moment, she knew. History had swallowed queens before her, and it would not hesitate to do it again. She was locked in a stone chamber that smelled of mold and damp betrayal. No fire, no warmth, only cold stone, watching her like a second jailer. And still, she did not cry. Instead, she asked for paper. She wrote a letter, not just to the Queen, but to fate itself, measured, controlled. But beneath the formalities, her desperation bled through. "I am the daughter of a king," she wrote, "yet I beg, not demand. I seek only justice." She did not plead innocence with tears. She pled it with logic. Every word was placed with care, like a soldier on a chessboard. She reminded her captors of her loyalty, her silence, her obedience. She danced around the truth, not because she was guilty, but because guilt didn't matter here, only perception did. Outside her chamber, men argued. Advisors to Queen Mary demanded her death. She was too dangerous, too clever, too beloved. And worst of all, she had a claim. Inside her chamber, Elizabeth read the Psalms. Day by day, she withered, meals untouched, the cold sinking into her bones. Her hand trembled as she wrote, but her mind remained sharp. She knew that one false move, one wrong word, and she would join her mother. Then, one evening, a visitor, a priest sent to elicit confession. He spoke of sin, ambition, treason. She listened, then answered, "My greatest ambition is peace, and my deepest loyalty is silence. If these be sins, then God help us all." Weeks passed. The rebellion had been crushed, but her fate remained undecided. Outside, the world turned. Inside, she waited. And then, an order. Not execution, but exile. She would be removed from the tower and placed under house arrest at Woodstock. She didn't celebrate. She knew this was not mercy, but postponement. As they led her from the tower, she paused. Her fingers brushed the cold stone. "Much has passed through these walls," she whispered, "but I will walk out, not vanish." And she did. She lived not because they spared her. She lived because she had made herself impossible to kill. If this chapter of shadows and resilience moved you, please consider liking or subscribing to the channel. Let's keep honoring the stories of those who survived, not with swords, but with silence sharp as steel. Their voices still matter, and so does yours. The walls of Woodstock had been her cage, but she had survived them just as she had the tower. Years passed, seasons changed, and with them the wind shifted, cold and uncertain. Queen Mary I, once iron-hearted and burning with fire, grew pale. Her body weakened. Her prayers, once so thunderous, softened into whispers. And then one day, they stopped entirely. Mary Tudor was dead. And with her death, the kingdom turned its eyes, not with joy, not with welcome, but with narrowed suspicion, toward the woman it once tried to bury, Elizabeth. There was no triumph in her steps as she was summoned to London. There was caution. There was calculation. Even joy had to be rehearsed. The road back was paved not with roses but with questions. Would she be another tyrant? Another pawn? or something altogether new? The court watched her. The nobles whispered. The bishops crossed themselves. And she smiled. Not wide, not openly, but just enough. Enough to say, "You don't know me. Not yet." She stood before the council, calm, composed, the crown within reach, but heavy with implication. "This is the Lord's doing," she said, "and it is marvelous in our eyes." Her first words as queen. The coronation was not just a ritual, it was war waged in silk and scripture. The bishops argued, could a woman rule? Could a Protestant ascend? But the people came, in thousands. Through mud and frost, they gathered, some for curiosity, some for hope, and many because they'd known no peace in decades, and maybe, just maybe, this new queen would bring it. She entered Westminster not as a lion but as a shadow given form. Draped in cloth of gold, her hair a fiery crown of its own, she moved like someone who had been waiting her whole life for this moment, and never thought it would come. She kneeled. She rose. The crown touched her head, and with it, centuries of doubt. The archbishop's hands trembled. Outside, cannon fire announced her name. Inside, she was already rewriting it. The nobles bowed, but behind each bow was a question. Would she marry? Would she bend? Would she break? And she gave them no answer, only a gaze steady as winter. She walked among the people, touched hands, listened, laughed, just enough. She knew this crown was not hers by birthright alone. It had to be held by force of will. And she had learned from the best, not from her father's rage, not from her sister's fire, but from her own silence. A silence that now thundered through the halls of power. In private, she prayed. In public, she dazzled. And in both, she remembered every stone, every cell, every name that had underestimated her. Now she was queen, not because the world wanted her, but because it could no longer deny her. If you believe strength can rise from the coldest places, from exile and doubt, consider subscribing or sharing this story. Let history know we still listen. Because sometimes the one they never prepared for becomes the one they never forget. The crown was hers, but peace was not. From the moment Elizabeth took the throne, the question crept into every whisper, every hallway, every embroidered curtain that swayed in the draft. Whom would she marry? Marriage was not romance. It was war by other means. The Spanish pushed forward Prince Philip, wrapped in gold and Catholic certainty. The French sent Duke of Anjou, his portrait perfumed and smiling. The Holy Roman Empire paraded suitors as if offering her livestock. But Elizabeth saw through the veils of courtship. She knew that every offer of love was an act of conquest. Every flirtation was a dagger, velvet sheathed. Every bouquet hid a noose. So she waited, listened, declined, postponed, played with time like a cat plays with a bird. To the outside world, it seemed she toyed with nations. Inside, she sharpened herself into something sovereign. "I am already married to England," she finally declared, standing before courtiers whose eyes widened and then lowered. It was not a romantic flourish. It was strategy crystallized into a sentence, one that would echo through history. But behind that brilliance lay a quieter storm. No husband meant no heir. No heir meant power ripe for stealing. And where power can be stolen, spies grow like moss. They came in through the seams. Chambermaids who hummed foreign tunes. Ambassadors too curious about the queen's sleep schedule. Guards whose eyes lingered too long on tapestries. Elizabeth felt them. Not always seen but sensed, like a breath on the nape of her neck. Some were sent from Rome, others from Paris. A few, terrifyingly, were homegrown, planted by noble families who smiled at her during banquets and plotted during Mass. She danced through it all, each step measured, each smile rehearsed. Behind every gesture, a wall. Even love was weaponized. Robert Dudley remained by her side, his presence stirring gossip and envy. But she let the rumors swirl, neither confirming nor denying. The ambiguity itself was armor. Until one night the palace breathed wrong. The wind didn't howl, but it whispered. A draft crept into her chamber, cold and foreign. The candle flickered as if startled. Then, movement. She turned just enough to see it. A figure cloaked in midnight, a blade drawn in silence. She didn't scream. Queens do not scream. The struggle was brief. Blood on the marble, a gasp, the sound of guards arriving too late. The assassin was taken. But the message remained. Even queens are mortal. The next morning, Elizabeth stood before her court draped in white and pearls, face serene, voice unwavering. She said nothing of the attack, but she did not need to. Every eye on her knew she had survived something they could not name. From that day, her solitude hardened into rule. She adjusted the court's rhythm. No one entered her chambers unannounced. Every meal was tested, every paper triple-checked. But her most powerful defense was the intangible, uncertainty. Every man who sought her hand was greeted with grace and left with questions. She flirted with kingdoms, not kings. She let France hope, let Spain wait, let suitors believe. She became the Virgin Queen, a puzzle carved into marble. And yet, in quiet moments, she wondered, what did a queen trade for safety? What had she lost in exchange for a throne that watched her even in sleep? She thought of her mother's fate, the silence of that final walk to the scaffold, the unblinking stares, the absence of comfort. Elizabeth had learned early, silence is a shield. So she wore hers with elegance, with calculation, with devastating clarity. To the world, she was untouchable. To herself, she was surviving in plain sight. And if you believe that power is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep moving through it, then perhaps this story speaks to you. Like, subscribe, share if you've ever chosen strength over surrender, solitude over compromise. Because in her silence, she roared louder than any king ever could. The throne had weathered storms of steel and whispers of betrayal, but to endure the test of time it required more than might. It required a myth. And so Elizabeth crafted one with meticulous care, the Virgin Queen, not merely a woman without a husband, but a figure untouched, unowned, and unbroken. She became the embodiment of an idea larger than flesh, a sovereign who married her country, pledged herself to a people, and ascended beyond the reach of any man. This was not born from sentiment, nor from fear of love. It was born from watching queens fall, trapped in bedsheets, betrayed in palaces, reduced to wombs with crowns. Elizabeth had studied their ruins like scripture, so she rewrote the gospel. In closed chambers, she summoned her architects of illusion, painters, poets, tailors, theologians. They did not simply adorn her, they elevated her. She wore white, the shade of celestial purity, and silver, the echo of moonlight. Her wardrobe whispered holiness, her portraits sang divinity. She borrowed the image of Diana, goddess of the hunt, chaste and unyielding, bow in hand, moon at her back. Elizabeth too would be a huntress, not of beasts, but of devotion, loyalty, and time. No wrinkle ever touched her painted image. Her eyes held storms, but her skin remained as smooth as porcelain. Her hair, ablaze in auburn curls, seemed spun from sunlight itself, held in place by circlets crafted like halos. These were not depictions. They were declarations. The people bowed not to a woman, but to a vision. Foreign dignitaries dared not meet her gaze too long, unsure if they addressed monarch or myth. Courtiers praised her radiance as though it healed them. and she pressed deeper into the legend. A royal decree swept through the court. No one, under any circumstance, was to speak of the queen's marriage prospects. No idle chatter, no hopeful whispers. To do so was to court exile. Even jest became treason. In erasing the question, she gained the answer: absolute authority. When pressed about her future, she replied with a smile sharp as glass. "I am already married to England," she said, and the walls of Europe trembled with the implications. That sentence was not a statement, it was a fortress. And yet behind the walls, there were chambers no ambassador would ever enter. She laughed in public, but wept in private silence. She danced at banquets, but returned to rooms echoing only with parchment and ink. She wore the title of Virgin Queen with pride, but in the dead hours of night, even myth-makers feel the weight of solitude. Still, she did not bend. She did not yield. Because she knew this was not just about her. It was about power, who owned it, who defined it, and whether a woman could shape it without surrendering to love or lineage. She knew the world would try to define her by absence. No husband, no children. So she filled that void with presence, radiant, commanding, eternal. She turned ambiguity into armor. She made silence speak for her. She taught the world that a woman could rule not despite mystery, but through it. And perhaps that is why her myth endures. Not because she was beyond human, but because she made humanity majestic. If you've ever believed that strength can bloom from solitude, and image can command empires, then maybe, just maybe, this tale was yours to hear. The palace glittered with music and wine, but beneath the velvet daggers moved. Not the kind you draw, but the kind you disguise, sharpened with envy, tipped with ambition. Elizabeth understood from a young age that the court was not a home, it was a performance, and she was both lead actress and audience, watching it all with an unblinking gaze. It sparkled on the surface. Gilded banquets, embroidered gowns, poetry sung by golden voices. But underneath, the game was always afoot. The court was a chessboard, and she, the queen, did not merely move pieces. She watched for hands reaching toward them. Around her, alliances bloomed and wilted overnight. Those who pledged loyalty in the morning might dine with her enemies by dusk, but she let them think she didn't see. That was the genius. Some called her cold. Others whispered she had spies in every hall. The truth was quieter. Elizabeth made herself the mirror into which others feared to look. She listened to servants more than ministers. She remembered trifles others forgot. And when the time came, she acted without warning. It began with small disappearances. A lord who once stood beside her throne was suddenly not invited to the spring hunt. A noblewoman whose brother wrote one ill-timed letter found herself seated near the kitchens. No accusations, no trials, just absence. And those absences echoed. The court became a theater of eyes. People watched themselves in each polished goblet, careful not to speak too freely, not to glance too long. Every gesture might be seen. Every silence might be judged. Elizabeth fed this uncertainty. At feasts, she sat in calculated silence. When guests laughed too loud or too long, she raised a single eyebrow. When they complimented her dress, she'd reply with a riddle. When they toasted her health, she sometimes let the cup pass untouched, but at other times she dazzled. She danced with charm and fire, her steps precise, her gaze drifting just enough to make every man in the room feel chosen, and none certain. Music was more than entertainment, it was strategy. The rhythms of the lute masked her analysis. In the pauses between notes, she counted who bent closer to whom, who whispered during a crescendo. And when the music stopped, she remembered. There was one night, warm, heady with rose and wine, when the court gathered for a masked ball. Elizabeth appeared last, cloaked in silver, her mask a tapestry of stars. Her presence silenced the room. As couples danced, she remained still, watching. A coterie of men approached, seeking favor. One, a man long favored, spoke too confidently about Spain's recent move in the Netherlands. Elizabeth's fan paused mid-motion. Her eyes flicked to him, just once. He was never seen again. His name was not carved into the walls of traitors. There was no scandal, just silence. His home stripped of livery. His seat at council empty. The others learned. And so the court adapted. Smiles grew tighter. Allegiances more layered. Poetry was no longer just verse, it was currency. A sonnet praising her eyes might secure a duchy. A misplaced metaphor might bring exile. Rumors bloomed like thistle. That she read minds. That she trained hawks with coded ribbons. That her ring bore a hidden blade dipped in a toxin from the east. None were true, but she never denied them. Mystery became her weapon. Ambiguity her shield. Even her favorites, those closest to her, could not be sure where they stood. And in this kingdom of fog and formality, Elizabeth stood firm, not just as monarch, but as enigma. Her silence echoed down corridors more powerfully than any edict. And yet, amid this machinery of mirrors and shadows, she was not heartless. She laughed, she mourned, she remembered birthdays and last names. But even her warmth was wrapped in calculation, parceled in gestures designed to keep the court guessing. She did not need brute force. Her court obeyed because it feared being forgotten. If you've come this far, you've seen the glitter. But now, you've heard the whisper behind it. Stay close. In this palace of reflections, trust is the most dangerous dance of all. The palace never slept, but tonight, something was missing from its heartbeat. The corridors echoed without music. No harp, no lute, no murmur of poetry along the velvet-lined halls. The fire burned low in the queen's chamber, but she did not summon more wood. She sat alone, dressed not in the regal crimson of ceremony, but in somber black, the color of restraint, the hue of a memory buried under statecraft. Robert Dudley was dead. To the world he had been her master of the horse, a loyal servant, a courtier of charm. But to Elizabeth he had been the first, and perhaps only, man who truly knew the girl behind the crown. The girl who had hidden behind tapestries as a child, eavesdropping on treason. The girl who had watched her own mother walk to the scaffold. The girl who had learned to never say what she felt, to smile when her heart burned. Robert had seen her before the mask. They had grown up together, their lives intertwined by fate, by politics, and by a fondness neither dared name. When Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower, Robert was one of the few who dared visit, bringing her books, small notes, and once, a pressed sprig of lavender hidden inside a psalter. She never forgot that. When she became queen, she elevated him, but never too high. Their love, if it was love, lived in shadow. It walked the gardens at dusk, but never lingered in the sun. At court, they shared glances like secrets, smiles like battles won. He danced at her side during masks, whispered clever jests, and once, when she was too tired to speak, simply held her gaze with the kind of silence that speaks louder than affection. But then came Amy Robsart, Robert's wife, a woman rarely seen at court, a woman who, one day, was found dead at the foot of a staircase, a broken neck, no witnesses, only rumors. Elizabeth's court became a storm of suspicion. The whispers were venomous. Did the queen wish Amy dead? Did Robert? The scandal could have destroyed them both. Elizabeth knew that. And so she stepped back, not from Robert's presence, but from any chance of acknowledgement. She loved England more than any man, and England would not forgive a queen who chose passion over image. Robert remained, ever loyal. But something changed. They still wrote letters, but no longer signed them with pet names. They still met in gardens, but never alone. Years passed. Elizabeth ruled with increasing brilliance. Her court grew more elaborate, her speeches more commanding. She became the Virgin Queen, a symbol rather than a woman. But even symbols have ghosts, and Robert Dudley became one. When the news came, it was sudden. He had died in his bed at Cornbury Park, alone, clutching a letter never sent. Elizabeth held the letter for hours before opening it. The contents have never been made public, but those who saw her after said her face was pale, as if all the color had been drained by a single sentence. She locked herself in her chamber for 2 days. The court dared not disturb her. Meals were left untouched. Ministers waited in silence. The only sound was the steady tap of rain on the palace windows, as if the sky itself mourned with her. When she emerged, she wore a new gown, midnight black. She held no audience. She spoke only to her lady-in-waiting, who recalled the words later. "He is gone," the queen said, "and I am left." She never visited his grave. But each year, on the anniversary of his death, she would spend the evening alone, rereading a small bundle of letters tied in gold ribbon. Those closest to her said she was never the same. Her laughter became rarer, her silences longer, but she remained composed, her rule unwavering. If anything, she became sharper, more decisive, more untouchable. Because now love was not only impossible, it was buried. She once told an ambassador that she had no need for a husband. "I am already married," she said, "to England." But the truth lived elsewhere, in the folds of a letter hidden beneath the lining of her bodice, next to her heart. A letter that bore no seal, only a name, Robert. In that name lived everything she could never say. And so she ruled, alone, but never empty, hardened, but never hollow. Her love locked behind the throne, where no one, not even history, could pry it free. In a kingdom where steel once spoke louder than words, she rewrote power in silence, silk, and symbolism. Elizabeth Tudor had survived scandal, imprisonment, and loneliness. But now she faced a greater challenge: permanence. She was no longer just queen, she became eternal. She understood early that power fades if it's not sculpted into memory, and memory, she knew, was more easily swayed by beauty, by ritual, by art. So she became her own artist, crafting an image that would defy time itself. Gone was the young girl who walked corridors in cautious silence. Now she emerged each day like a celestial being sculpted by human hands. Her dresses were not just fashion, they were declarations. Velvet embedded with pearls like stars in a twilight sky. Sleeves stiff with gold thread, cuffs heavy with emblems of statecraft and chastity. Her hair was not her own. It was a crown of flame-red wigs, towering and coiled, suggesting a vitality untouched by age. Her face, powdered in layers of white lead, a choice as dangerous as it was deliberate, refused to betray a single wrinkle. Her blush, her lips, her posture, they whispered divinity, not mortality. She turned portraits into policy. In the Armada portrait, she placed her hand atop the globe, eyes alight with victory. Behind her, the defeated Spanish fleet broke in stormy seas, while her visage remained calm, omnipotent. In the Ditchley portrait, she stood quite literally above England, casting light upon the storm below. These were not likenesses, they were spells. But it was the rainbow portrait that transcended even myth. In it, she wore a gown embroidered with eyes and ears, symbols of her surveillance, her awareness, her omnipresence. In her hand, a rainbow, accompanied by Latin text, non sin sol iris, no rainbow without the sun. She, of course, was the sun. Every detail was curated. She forbade painters to capture her without permission. Mirrors slowly disappeared from her presence as age crept in. To speak of the queen's failing health, to hint at her humanity, was to court exile. The Virgin Queen was to remain untouchable, unchanged, unchallenged. The rituals of her court supported the illusion. Her footsteps were timed with music, her entrances rehearsed, her speeches rehearsed and rewoven, laced with allegory and delivered with the gravity of scripture. When she walked into a room, all eyes lowered, not by command, but by awe. She had become something beyond reach. Foreign ambassadors reported with disbelief. This woman, nearing 70, wielded more control than kings half her age. But they misunderstood. It wasn't that she ruled despite her years. It was that she had erased them. Even her mortality was edited. The people forgot her fevered nights, her trembling hands, the days she stayed behind the curtain. What they remembered was her silhouette on the balcony, ageless and ablaze in the sun. She never married. She never bore children. Yet she birthed an era, a myth, and a nation's enduring devotion. And so, even as her body weakened, the image endured. An empress forged of fabric and vision, a sovereign not only of a country, but of imagination. She had outlived her enemies, her suitors, her lovers. And now, she would outlive time. Because Elizabeth was not just painted, she was permanent. In a world where power was often brutal and fleeting, she chose to make hers eternal, not by war or blood, but by paint, fabric, and myth. By the time Elizabeth stood in the full glow of her reign, she was no longer just a monarch. She had become an idea. It began slowly, with pearls sewn into her gowns until they shimmered like the Milky Way. With ruffs so wide they framed her face like halos in stained glass. With hair the color of fire and skin bleached into ghostliness, she walked through her palaces not as a woman, but as a vision. Her attendants painted her face daily with white lead, thick and cold. Her cheeks blushed unnaturally red, lips shaped like silent commandments. It was not beauty, it was intention. The Queen of England would not be seen aging, weakening, changing. She was to be eternal. Portraits became weapons. Every brushstroke was a command. Every canvas, a lie that told a deeper truth. In the famous Armada portrait, she stood hand upon the globe, the sea behind her conquered. In the Ditchley portrait, she hovered over a stormy land, untouchable and bright. And then, the most mythic of them all, the rainbow portrait. She wore eyes and ears embroidered into her dress, a queen who saw all, heard all. In her hand, she held a rainbow, the words inscribed nearby, non sin sole iris, no rainbow without the sun. She was the sun. That image, more than any law or army, ruled England. It was not Elizabeth, the woman who sat on the throne. It was Elizabeth the myth, unchanging, unyielding, unknowable. Even her court understood that to speak of the Queen's age, her illnesses, her human needs, was to tread on sacred ground. She banned mirrors from her chambers when time began to betray her. She dismissed painters who dared paint her truthfully. Once, a foreign diplomat remarked that he had never seen a monarch so cloaked in theater. But what he failed to understand was that the theater was the crown. The illusion was the rule. The costume was the commandment. She did not trust men to build her legacy. She painted it herself. The crimson wigs, the golden armor worn in portraits, the stars sewn into velvet. They were not extravagance. They were strategy. Every inch of her appearance told her subjects, I am more than a woman. I am destiny in human form. and in time, the people forgot the girl who was once a political pawn, a prisoner in the tower, a daughter of scandal. They remembered only the virgin queen, clothed in symbols, speaking in riddles, surrounded by light. She had written herself into legend, not with ink, but with presence. And that, in the end, was the most permanent power of all. But no myth survives without facing the test of fire. And fire came from the sea. The year was 1588. The Spanish Armada, a fleet of over 130 ships, armed and blessed by the Pope, surged toward English shores. It was not merely an act of war, it was a divine mission to crush heresy and unseat the heretic queen. Spain, with its gold and galleons, its priests and gunpowder, believed it was destined to bring England to its knees. Elizabeth, ever the strategist, waited. Her advisors debated, her generals prepared. But the queen? She chose a different battlefield, one of image, one of words. At Tilbury, as the Armada approached, Elizabeth rode out on horseback to address her assembled troops. She wore a white velvet gown, a steel breastplate gleaming over her heart. Around her, soldiers watched, not just a monarch, but a myth made flesh. Her voice rang out over the fields. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." It was thunder in words. Her enemies had ships. She had loyalty, defiance, and fire. The Armada, mighty and ordained, was undone not by sword, but by storm. Winds scattered Spanish ships like chaff. English fire ships turned harbors into chaos. Disease and confusion spread among Philip II's men. The great Catholic lion had roared and found its prey too cunning, too elusive. News of the English victory swept through Europe like an unexpected tide. Elizabeth became more than a queen. She was the Protestant bulwark, the chosen of heaven, the lionheart who stood firm as the sea raged. And yet, she celebrated not with parades, but with silence. The victory was her nation's, not hers alone. But her image, her speech at Tilbury, her presence at the storm's edge, became immortal. Spain would recover. England would rise. But forevermore, when kings spoke of courage, when queens faced their darkest hours, they would remember her. A woman who refused to flinch. A monarch who stared down an empire. And when the winds of war howled, it was her voice they echoed, not just the heart of a king, but the will of a legend. She had defied death in battle, defied kings with her words. But in the end, Elizabeth faced her most persistent enemy, not men, not empires, but time itself, and she would not let it win. As the years crept upon her, Elizabeth did not grow old, not in public, not in stories, not in paint. While her body ached and her steps slowed, she tightened her grip on the crown and cloaked herself in myth even tighter. Aging, for other women, might be natural. For a queen who had made herself eternal, it was betrayal. No one was permitted to see her without the white mask. No one. Even in the early hours when sleep had just left her and breath was still thick from dreams, she would rise in darkness and call for her paint. The white lead, the rouge, the shaped lips like red petals folded in silence. These were not cosmetics. They were armor. Aging, after all, was vulnerability. And Elizabeth had built her entire reign upon the illusion of permanence. Painters were warned. No wrinkles, no sagging cheeks, no shadows under the eyes. To portray the queen truthfully was to commit a quiet form of treason. One foreign artist, unaware of the unspoken law, painted her with lines around her mouth, gentle, even flattering. But when the painting was unveiled, Elizabeth stared at it in silence. Then, with icy calm, she ordered it destroyed. Every copy, every sketch. As if time itself could be erased by fire, she kept no mirrors in her chambers after a certain age. "Why should I look," she once whispered to a lady in waiting, "when I already know what I must see?" Her fear was not of beauty lost, but of power slipping, of being seen as mortal, as replaceable. She began dressing herself alone, not out of modesty, but to hide the truth. She would not allow even her maids to glimpse her bare shoulders, her thinning arms. When she walked into court, she was an apparition, flawless, ageless, floating. No one dared question how many hours it took to achieve that illusion, or how much silence she endured to preserve it. Some days she trembled in private. Her joints stiffened, her teeth pained her. But in public, she would rise, fully adorned, and hold her counsel, her voice firm, her eyes calculating, her posture unyielding. "I am still your sovereign," her silence seemed to say, "and I will never step down." As suitors aged, died, or retired, she stayed. As advisors passed into the grave, she appointed new ones, young, sharp, loyal, and still she remained, a statue who refused to crack. But beneath the powder and lace, a quieter fear grew, not of dying but of being forgotten, of her name fading like ink left in rain, of her myth being worn down by younger, newer stories. So she doubled down. Portraits became more symbolic, her hair redder, her jewels larger, her speeches more laden with riddles and prophecy. She was no longer just the virgin queen. She was becoming something else, a relic alive, a temple breathing, a legend unwilling to close her chapter. And still, she walked. Still, she ruled. Because in the mirror she refused to look into, she saw the truth. That time, patient and merciless, waits for no queen. But she would make it wait, even if just a little longer. The end did not arrive like a storm. It came like a shadow stretched across a golden room, slow, silent, and impossible to ignore. But Elizabeth ignored it anyway. When the coughs began to shake her ribs, she tightened her bodice. When the aches crept into her spine, she stood straighter. And when her legs trembled beneath the weight of her own image, she walked, as always, in silence. No one was to see her falter. She had made herself into something immortal, and immortality does not bend. Physicians whispered of rest, of warm beds, of herbal tonics and quiet rooms. But Elizabeth refused to lie down. Day after day she remained upright, cloaked in the shadow of her myth. Even in the stillness of her chambers, she sat on velvet cushions rather than be seen reclining. "If I lie down," she once murmured, "I may never rise again." And so she didn't. Her courtiers came and went with bowed heads, delivering messages she no longer answered. Her council waited, their parchments untouched, decisions hanging in the air like smoke. Foreign ambassadors sent letters asking who would rule next, but there was no answer. Elizabeth had never named an heir, not truly, not aloud. She was not finished being queen. The room grew darker with each day, despite the candles. She stopped eating. The white lead on her face cracked, but was reapplied. Her crimson wig tangled and dulled, but no one dared remove it. She sat in silence, unyielding, a monarch frozen between legend and flesh. And then came the murmured final hours. No priest had been summoned, no grand farewell arranged. Her ladies stood around her in hushed sorrow, their hands hovering, unsure whether to reach for a woman or a crown. And Elizabeth, still seated, eyes half closed, whispered something that no one could fully understand. Her final words, drifting somewhere between prophecy and farewell, have been lost to time. Some say she named James of Scotland. Others say she only breathed the name of her father. But the truth? The truth lies buried with her. When she finally passed, It was not in a bed surrounded by mourners. It was on her feet as she had always intended, though those feet had long since failed her. Her body had sagged beneath the weight of her own refusal. But her image? Her image never collapsed. No one alive had seen her without her mask in decades. No one knew what the real Elizabeth looked like anymore. And perhaps that was her final triumph. She did not die as a woman. She died as the last act of a play no one else could perform. A queen who never knelt. A woman who would rather fade into myth than fade into age. And in the silence that followed her final breath, England paused, not just for mourning, but for the ending of something unrepeatable. The Virgin Queen, the Lionheart, the enigma in pearls and gold, had walked off the stage, leaving behind only echoes and awe. The throne stood empty, and history stood still. They buried her in silence. No royal children wept by the coffin. No son raised a sword in her name. No daughter clutched a legacy sewn into her hymn. The woman who had ruled a kingdom with nothing but will and myth had left behind no blood to inherit her crown. And yet, the world trembled. London did not sleep the night the bells tolled for Elizabeth. The streets were choked with breathless silence, not from command, but from grief. Taverns whispered, churches overflowed. In alleyways and courts, from the brocade halls of nobles to the soot-covered doorsteps of commoners, her name hovered like fog, not as ruler now, but as memory. She had no child, and yet she had raised a nation. In the years to come, the historians would call it the Elizabethan Age, a time when ink bled brilliance, when poets and dreamers stepped onto wooden stages and made the air throb with verse. The queen who had never written a play had inspired William Shakespeare to pen kings and fools, witches and heroes, women who bled meaning into every monologue. She had never commanded an orchestra, yet music blossomed in her courts like spring. She had never painted a canvas, but every artist reached for her light. Her image, wreathed in lace and flame, was pressed into coins, etched into glass, sewn into banners, burned into stained glass windows. Not just in England, but across the sea, where Spanish fleets had once sunk, and where diplomats had once feared the sharpness of her smile, her presence haunted stone and story alike. And still, no child bore her name. James of Scotland took her throne, a man she had never raised, a boy she had once considered a threat. He walked into the palace not as heir of her flesh, but as heir of her absence, and even he, crowned with new ambition, could not erase her. For how do you inherit a ghost? Elizabeth had not left England with blood, but with blueprint. She had taught a nation to think with subtlety, to lead with restraint, to veil steel beneath silks. She had shown the world that power could whisper, and that a woman need not marry to command an empire. She had turned virginity into symbol, solitude into strength, performance into permanence. And in that legacy, she multiplied. She lived in every girl who learned to wield words sharper than swords, in every court that cloaked intention in theater, in every land where myth outlasted mortality. She died without a crown passed to a child's brow, but her crown never left. It floated above history, untouchable, gleaming. Not lineage, legend. In the quiet that follows power, there are no trumpets, only questions. They said she died surrounded by shadows, candles burning low, no music, no crowds. The palace, once echoing with silks and secrets, now listened to her breath falter like a tide retreating from the shore. And in those final days, when sleep clung to her more than wakefulness, they say Elizabeth whispered not orders, but memories. She remembered the throne, not as a gift, but as a cage she had chosen. She had ruled longer than any before her. She had turned back the tide of empires, reshaped a kingdom with only her mind and myth. Yet no hand had ever held hers in the dark. No child had whispered mother into her ear. No lover had stayed until the morning without becoming a risk. She had loved England, but England could not love back. The courtiers often wondered, had she ever regretted? Had the crown ever felt cold? In her last lucid moment, one lady dared to ask what she would have done had life begun again. Elizabeth looked to the far window, where no sunlight reached. "If I had to live again," she said slowly, "I would still be queen." Then, after a pause, "But I might have let someone hold my hand." No one answered. How could they? History remembers her not for who she loved, but for who she became. Not for the warmth she gave, but for the fire she was. Not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a monarch who bent time, who painted power on her skin and wore solitude like silk. The title she carried was not a gift from marriage, nor a continuation of bloodline. It was carved from silence, stitched from pain, written in steel and stagecraft. The Virgin Queen, the woman who loved no one, and yet belonged to everyone. And in the silence of her end, as the candles sputtered out, the world did not forget. Because the crown she wore did not die with her. It lived in whispers, in portraits, in pages, in legends. Not passed down, but lifted into myth. Some people leave behind children, and some leave behind legends. Elizabeth wasn't a mother, she wasn't a wife, but she was a flame, burning in the shadows, brighter than the throne she claimed. Her life was a paradox, from a discarded child to an unforgettable queen, from a heart that once longed for love to a symbol that never showed loneliness. She chose power over comfort, silence over softness, a myth over mortality. And maybe that's what made her eternal. If you're still here, listening to these final words, then maybe you, like me, weren't just looking for a story, but for a soul, a feeling, a truth that lingers after everything else fades. Thank you, truly, for staying with me through this journey. If Elizabeth's story touched something in you, leave a sign, a like, a comment, even just the word resonated, so I'll know you were here. And if you want to keep exploring the quiet corners of history, don't forget to subscribe. There are still so many legends left to whisper. Thank you. And until we meet again.